The words copy and original are ambiguous concepts in the context of film restoration. An original, for instance, can be a material artifact, such as a camera negative. The film that runs through the camera is arguably the most original state of what will eventually make it to the screen. An original can also be a more conceptual artifact, such as a particular version of a film, a director's cut, for example. The tension between these material and conceptual originals, in other words, what is restored and how, is central in the film restoration debate. Ideally, the restoration of a film begins with the most original material artifact available in order to achieve the most aesthetically pleasing results. In practice, however, that is often not the original camera negative, as that unique element might, for example, not have survived. In such cases, a later generation element, sometimes several copies away from that original negative, such as a distribution copy, is used as the source material. Once the source materials are chosen, they are prepared for smooth transportation through a printer or scanner, but restoration is never performed on these originals. This sets apart the practice of film restoration over comparable practices on artifacts that are exclusively unique originals. The restoration of a painting, for instance, is something entirely different than the restoration of a film. In the restoration of a painting, as you can see here in Operation Night Watch, there is one original on which is worked. Restoring a film always involves making new copies, and sometimes involves making new versions. The 2008 restoration of Pandora's Box is a great example to illustrate some of these issues. Pandora's Box is a German film from 1929, directed by Georg Wilhelm Pabst. The film enjoys a cult status today. This is in part because the blonde in this breathtaking tango scene has been referred to as the first explicitly drawn lesbian character on film. Another reason for its cult status is because the hypnotic brunette, of course, is Louise Brooks. Now perhaps most famous for that hair, nicknamed the Black Helmet, it is hard to believe she was once an unknown. The girl from Kansas was famously chosen for the role over Marlene Dietrich, and the Germans were outraged that she would play their Lulu. Not only are the film's original camera negatives missing, and the handful of film elements that do survive each have their own technical imperfections. The film was also heavily censored. Some of the more subversive characters and objectionable scenes were rewritten and recut into more acceptable subplots for different markets. In the German uncensored original, for example, Lulu is, spoiler alert, murdered by Jack the Ripper at the end of the film. In the US version, however, she joins the Salvation Army and lives happily ever after. The film's restoration took 3 years and involved a collaborative effort amongst international producers, funders, curators, archives, and post-production houses. The restoration was overseen at Haga Film Conservation in Amsterdam, where I had the role of restoration producer. Hugh Hefner, fan of Louise Brooks, funded the project. Since the film was heavily censored, the decision was made to try to put together the longest original uncensored version. As is usual in large restoration projects, archives worldwide were contacted to locate surviving film elements, and these copies were compared for their completeness as well as for their technical state. The conclusion for Pandora's Box was that there were no camera negatives left, nor any film copies that were made at the time of release. Duplicates from prints made in the 1950s and 60s became the project's source materials. A 1952 duplication from the Cinémathèque Française, a 1964 duplication from the Czech archive, and a 1970 dupe from the Russian Gosfilmofond. These copies were originally made from one camera negative, but went on into the world and lived different lives. Not only was the copying done independently in various countries in various ways, they also deteriorated and warped differently over time. These restoration originals were sometimes removed by many generations from that original camera negative. If you look closely at the perforations at the edge of this film negative, for instance, you see the printed through results of that process. A negative became a positive, which became a negative, which became a positive, each copy representing a significant loss in photographic quality. Each of these three elements had additional issues. One had a lot of scratches and printed in dust, for instance. The other, although cleaner in appearance, had principal scenes out of focus, as illustrated here in one of the lead characters' face. The film strip's warping over time results in a sort of breathing in and out of focus of the film. Efforts to restore Pandora's Box to the director's original uncensored version were initiated before, but the analog restoration technology available at the time proved insufficient. The scratches, blemishes, missing frames, and principal shots that were out of focus begged for digital intervention. The restoration curator set himself the goal of testing the boundaries of the possibilities of the digital tools. And although the title had been restored before, this restoration went further than any of those previous attempts. Criterion, who held the US home video rights to this title, brought out a 2-disc DVD set in 2006, for instance. There might be only a minimal difference in image size between a Criterion version on the left and the newest restoration on the right. The Criterion version zoomed in on the footage so that visibly printed through frame lines, for instance, were circumvented. In the most recent restoration, these were manually removed so that a slightly larger image was exposed. But let's look at what some 15 years ago constituted as the most extreme example in which the French and Czech versions were combined. One source had many scratches, the other had focus issues. So compositing tools were used to match the flicker, the grading, and image position to combine the two sources into a new copy. Had these individual copies not come from the same original, this would of course not have been possible. Once all the material was digitally restored, a new 35mm preservation negative was made, as well as new film prints and digital cinema presentation material. The producers of the restoration believed two things. One, that the underlying film was, or rather should be, in the public domain. And two, that their restoration constituted sufficient human authorship to claim copyright in their restoration as a new work. Upon completion of the project, however, they promptly receive a cease and desist letter from the rights holders of the US theatrical rights, and the film has virtually been locked in its respective vaults ever since. Permission was granted for the occasional theatrical screening, but most collaborating archives were afraid of lending their copies they had received in exchange for their contribution for these screenings. Not only because they might have been under contract with the restoration's producers, but also out of the simple fear that the copy might disappear. The German archive does screen their print, as they have the theatrical rights for the German-speaking territories except Switzerland. So if you have a chance to see it, grab it. It truly is a magnificently beautiful restoration. But what about this new copy of Pandora's Box? Is this a copy that has never existed before? Can we call this a new original? Or are the steps, no matter how far-reaching, part of what would be expected in the process of restoring a film to its original form? To my knowledge, copyright in film restorations has never been tested. With a release date of 1929, Pandora's Box will shortly fall into the public domain in the US. But that will happen to the version in which Lulu joins the Salvation Army only, the version that was released in the US. But the Netherlands, for instance, adheres to the rule of the shorter term, which means they will also treat the US version as public domain. But the Dutch Film Archive might very well hold different versions. For the German version, most European countries will have to wait another 15 years or so before that one will fall into the public domain. The interplay of copies and originals and their public accessibility is going to be interesting to watch. The public accessibility of films is important so that they can fulfill what film scholar Jana Jones calls their so-called potential for history making. In the 1920s, for instance, this film was not popular. But that changed when particularly Henri Langlois of the Cinémathèque Française and James Card of the George Eastman House rediscovered Louise Brooks in the 1950s. And ever since, history she has made indeed. The times that Lulu and her helmet hair have been the inspiration for musicians and filmmakers to denote a certain kind of woman are endless. And I will leave you with some of them.
Cold winds of Gotham howled, and the princess pawned a celluloid crown in the glass castle walls. But nobody knew your name. Nobody knew